Alright, here we are at the last role comparison video. If you missed the other two, check the links in the description below, and I saved the most interesting one for last, at least in my opinion. DPSing is very solid in both FF14 and WoW. Both these roles managed to stand out from the rest, at least in my opinion. Now, of course, as I always say, these are apples to oranges comparisons. In essence, these two games are the same, but they play radically different. However, the point of the series was never to find an objectively better game, but rather to have a fun little discussion. I love both these games, I enjoy making these videos, and hopefully you have enjoyed watching them. And I can absolutely say that this is my personal favorite series I've done on this channel. Now, before we get into the comparisons, I am once again going to repeat the disclaimers from the last two videos. The way I compare these is by comparing the roles in smaller AoE scenarios, think dungeons, versus a larger group setting, think raids. Dungeons are automatically going to be skewed in WoW's favor. FF14 just started doing the high-end dungeon content, and there's literally only one Criterion dungeon. Now, that's not a dig at FF14, but the comparison is going to be skewed in that category. I think Criterion dungeons are a great addition, and I cannot wait for more. That being said, I still like these two categories because these scenarios are similar in both games. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to it. So starting off with WoW dungeons, AoE is very interesting in WoW, and you'll hear me say this for FF14 as well. You see, in both of these games, tanking and healing tend to feel a bit samey between jobs or specs, more so with FF14 in my opinion, but when it comes to DPS, both of these games have more variety in their DPS specs, at least when it comes to gameplay. Now, this is the most popular role, and there are more DPS specs in both games, so that makes sense. But it does make comparing them a bit more difficult. One thing I could say is that in most WoW DPS specs, they work as you'd expect, and that is spamming AoE abilities. Some require a bit of setup, such as Marksmanship Hunter and Fury Warrior, both which require the use of one skill, think Trick Shot or Whirlwind, to get the lead out of your normal single target skills. Some, like Elemental Shaman, have multiple builds that rely on you spreading dots and debuffs, and it really depends on what you prefer. Dragonflight has a great talent system, and that variety definitely helps. Not to mention, Mythic Plus is very engaging content that keeps you on your toes. Even if I still find Mythic Plus flawed and oftentimes frustrating, it's definitely fun, especially with the right people. And a similar story for FF14. There are no talents, but the different jobs do feel different. The one that feels the most simple to me is Reaper, the classic 1-2 AoE combo that builds another 1-2 combo with a finisher. In the actual gameplay department, not bad at all. Where it does suffer, as you could guess, is in the content. The only Criterion dungeon ends up feeling a mini raid, which isn't bad, but it doesn't exactly differentiate itself from raids. And in terms of regular dungeons like healing and tanking, it's just pulling wall to wall. It's not that exciting or challenging. So as you probably guessed based on the huge disclaimer and the last two videos, I'm going to give this one to WoW. Again, full knowledge that FF14 is still taking baby steps with its high-end dungeon content. Alright, so let's pause. Are you subscribed? Did you know we are this close to 400 subscribers? You, that's right, you in front of the screen can hit one button, and with that one button that you can hit for free, you can dose my body with precious serotonin. So please consider subbing, liking the video, maybe leave me a funny comment. With that, we are on to the raids, and this is where things get really interesting. In WoW, it really depends on the fight and what kind of DPS you are. With WoW in particular, I feel that ranged and melee divide a lot more. For example, in Vault of the Incarnates, there are two bosses that have the same mechanic. This mechanic gives random players a lightning debuff that requires them to either wait it out or run into a pillar to clear it. However, if you run into another player, they will also get the debuff, spreading it like a disease. This mechanic sucks infinitely more for melee. You're forced to spread out of range, and sometimes you lose a lot of uptime. Whereas if you're ranged, it's going to be a lot easier. But on the flip side, with WoW raiding, there are more opportunities for you to use utility abilities. This is something that I brought up in the other two videos, but utility feels lacking in FF14, but I'll save that rant for a minute. There are so many abilities and opportunities to use them, you know, interrupts, CCs, movement boosts. It really makes me stand out in the raid. When I hit that skill, that's my unique skill. You know, that's my Windrush Totem, you know, that's my Stormbolt, Stampeding Roar, Innervate. There's so many unique things for every class. Not to mention, there is a lot of diversity in WoW raid fights. There are also a lot more fights per tier, and that leads to some hit or miss fights. But with this diversity, there's a lot of room for interesting mechanics. One of my favorite is Daphnia. This forces you to split the party into two, and you'll go to different platforms and kill adds. These adds require interrupts and massive AoE that really test your utility. And this is true of all roles, not just DPS, but either way, it's still awesome. And then there are fights like Broodkeeper that I just don't like. I know I just went on what seems like a side tangent, but it is also a part of this discussion. The way fights work does impact the way we enjoy them, no matter the role, which brings me to FF14. Now, I mentioned that 14 lacks utility, especially in raid settings, and I'm going to stand by that. There are obviously things like knockback, defensives, and healing utility spells that every DPS gets, but there's nothing unique for each job. There's no use for interrupts or CCs, which definitely takes away some engagement for me. In fact, most raid fights end up feeling a bit samey, and that's because they kind of are. In FF14, most raid fights are dance fights where mechanics are resolved by standing in the right place at the right time. Every fight is well telegraphed, meaning that mechanics happen in almost the same way. I would say I definitely feel progression more when raiding in FF14. It's very clear when you've made it to a new point in the fight, and that does feel rewarding. The issue comes when fights take too long to clear. When you see a mechanic play out in almost the exact same way for the 40th time, it can be exhausting. And to be fair, this is something that happens in WoW, but to a much lesser degree in my opinion. If I'm playing a tank or healer, chances are I'm going to get bored of progression fast. However, there's something I haven't told you yet. There's something I've kept hidden deep inside. I am a huge DPS whore. I'm that one raider who always has to be on the top. I am very competitive, and that's why DPS is my favorite role to raid with in FF14. I just talked about how static the encounters feel to me, but during progression, there is one thing that keeps me engaged, and that is optimization. With these repeated encounters, I'm able to get better and better at my rotation. This isn't a feeling I get with any other role. Frankly, I don't get this feeling with WoW either. However, there is one other downside. Well, downside on my book at least. The 2-minute burst window. If you don't know, every job in FF14 at this stage has buffs that come back after 2 minutes. These are usually your big spenders. Some are on 1 minute CDs, some are on 2, but basically every 2 minutes you do big damage. Some of these buff the raid, some just buff yourself. It's kind of cool. It's neat to see them interact with each other, but it's just not that interesting to me when every class has that. Again, this is all my opinion, but it's just not as engaging, and it's something I sort of bring up in my job homogenization video, although that's mainly talking about tanks. So, all that being said, here we are at the end. In every other comparison video, I've had a good idea of who was going to be the winner for each category before I even wrote the script, but I'm going to be honest, at least at the time of writing the script, I had no idea who was going to win this one. I really had to think this one out. I had to spend some time in my mind kind of sitting on it for a bit, but no way I'm going to pussy out of this one. I had to pick one winner. After all this time, I'm going to give it to FF14. But again, they're both great. And I mean, that's really a note that I want to end this series on. I could talk for hours about what I like at both these games, what I don't like in these games, but at the end of the day, I really enjoy playing them, and I had so much fun doing this, and I really hope you enjoyed watching. So thank you so much for watching this series, you guys. Be sure to check out the video on the screen right here. Thanks again, and take care.